As I keep building up functionality in my Zynq-7000 board here, I know one of the things at some point I'm going to want to take advantage of is a mouse. And so I've tried to get the mouse working on my build. And just as a recap, I have a USB host capability on this, and I'm going out of this port here into a 7-port USB hub. And that USB hub I have plugged in a USB thumb drive for storage. I have plugged in on and off. I've had an external USB to VGA adapter, which right now I do not have plugged in, trying to see if I get video out of that. And then I also have a USB keyboard and a USB mouse, and I've been using the USB keyboard through many of these past videos. But then the question is, can I get a USB mouse working? And in this video, I'm just going to talk through what have I done up to this point. I do have basic mouse functionality. I don't know where or how I'm going to use it yet, but I think from the hardware perspective, the mouse is working. And from the operating system, I'm seeing that the mouse is working. And I think a lot of it's now going to come down to specific applications and what are they expecting for mouse drivers or whatever it might be. So I think I'll start with just simply powering up my system. Now, real quick on the screen, what you're seeing in the upper right, this window here is HDMI output that I'm recording. Down here on the lower right, this window is just a webcam showing the board. And as I start moving the mouse later, just to kind of see how that's tracking. And as soon as I turn the system on, I'll connect up a serial connection, USB serial connection over here. So, okay, power on. Let me get this up and running. So it's booting up, and as it's doing that, it will start to show HDMI output once those drivers are loaded during the initialization. And then I'm going to want to log in right away. And the first thing I'm going to jump into is go into the dev folder. So get PetaLinux and change into dev. And if I take a look at this, there is an input folder, and I can do a directory in that folder and see something that looks like this. And if I back up a day or to the last video I had, I did not have these bottom two options, the one that says mice and the one that says mouse 0. But I did have the others, and event 0 and event 1 is where I was looking at to see, well, are either of those potentially a mouse? And here's what I can do at this point. I can do a listing, and I can say that I want to list by the ID, and it'll show me that I have this event 0, which looks like it's my Dell USB keyboard, and then event 1 is tied to my Microsoft 5-button mouse. And again, I did not have that last option that says mouse 0, so that wasn't there when I started this process. But what I can do though is I can cat that event. So I can say cat, or show me output of this event 1. And now if I come down here and I move my mouse, you'll see that it's grabbing data. And if I push a button, left, right, scroll the mouse wheel, move it around, it's definitely getting something from the mouse. And that's the first thing I was seeing with the configuration when I started with this, prior to actually getting this working. I'm going to break out of that. And sometimes I know when I do that, it messes up my prompt depending on the characters that come through. So I'm going to just simply type sudo reboot. Let it reboot here quick and see if that clears up my HDMI output since I messed it up. So that was the kind of the first step of me saying, well, I think from a hardware perspective, then maybe the USB mouse is working. I know it gets powered up. It recognizes it on boot. So I know coming over here, as I would scroll through this, I would find the content like here. I'll wait till this gets done and then I'll scroll back up. But I would look through my boot up and I'd see that, yeah, it loads up my all of my USB. So it loads up back up here. I keep going. Let's see how far back I need to go. But it does find my different USB drivers. So here interface driver, USB keyboard, USB mouse. This is part of this USB core. And then along the way in here somewhere, it does recognize the hub as a 7-port hub. That's probably up higher. Yeah, so as I scroll up here, it found hub 1 port. That's probably what's on my board itself. And then it's going to continue and find a 7-port hub at some point as I go through this. So if I keep on scrolling down, here's where it finds my 7-port hub. And then I continue from there, and I see that it detects another USB device, a low-speed device. That's my Dell keyboard. And then another low-speed device, and that's my Microsoft 5-button mouse. Detects my USB thumb drive. So all of those are being detected. And I've seen that, on the boot for quite a while now, but the mouse didn't work with just what I have there. So I was seeing that, thinking the hardware's good, and I did take a look at, did I need to do anything special with basically my hardware tree, the DTSI file. And I guess if I go to my PetaLinux project, I can go into my project spec, and I can go into meta user and recipes BSP device tree and pull up the current device tree. And there is inside of this some stuff that relates to USB. So I do have this USB PHY 0, and I've had that in there, and that's been good. I did try to, let's see, I also have this USB 0 down here, and I've had this content in there. I've been experimenting again with this USB to VGA. I haven't had any success with that. It detects it, but I haven't been able to get output on it yet. But I had experimented with adding like a mouse at one, and at the end I found out I don't really need any of that. What I have here, really just this much, is sufficient between that and then this PHY up here to get my USB working just fine. So I'll get out of that because I'm not going to do much with that. So what I wanted to do then is to see, could I test the mouse? And what I decided to do was to install Nano. So I put Nano in as part of my image, and the reason is that as I was reading, it said that Nano had some level of mouse support. So I'd want to be able to come in here and move the mouse around, and I was not having any luck with that, and so I knew I was missing something yet. So maybe I'll talk through other things I did then as next steps. I did go in to my project, and I added some stuff to my custom layer. So in project spec, I have a my layer, and previously I had in there, let's see, this libSDL2 and this image magic. Those are things I added, but now I've added Nano. So I've got a little BB file here that basically goes out and gets Nano and gets that put into my build. So that's part of my image now. And then I also put in GPM. So that looks something like this. And so that's a general purpose mouse interface. So I installed that, and that allowed me then to do some testing with it. So it has a tool that I can go in and say GPM, and it would be, I'll show you kind of what it looks like here, although it's not going to work anymore at this point. But at the time, I was doing something like a GPM and saying, well, go out to that event 1. So dev input event 1. And I basically want to do a debug and treat it like a Microsoft keyboard. And I would run this, and I'll put a sudo in front of this. And that then would give me some output that showed that it was communicating to the mouse. It initialized it successfully. But then as soon as I moved the mouse, it just got into some loop and was screaming about invalid parameter. And that was the behavior I saw. Now, though, that I have it working, I get this. It says, no, this GPM has already been loaded by a different process, and I can't do I was just trying to do there, maybe without unloading GPM and reloading it first, which I'm not going to do right now. So GPM was interesting to troubleshoot with, But now I do see that it is out there running, and it ends up that it's automatically loading this now on my startup. So what else did I do? I mentioned the DTSI file. I experimented with that, but then I got into kernel drivers. And it ends up that I did add some kernel drivers. I know previously I've had a question of what all am I doing for USB? And so what I did is I came in here and let's see, jump over to my PetaLinux folder. I'll open up a command prompt or a terminal, and I'll get going on my loading my settings so that I can do PetaLinux stuff. But of course, I could go into PetaLinux and I could do a config, and I could basically configure the kernel. And I'll let it do that. But while it's doing that, it ended up, I went in and enabled some additional things. So I'm going to go into my project spec folder and meta user and kernel. And every time I go in, to this config kernel and I make some changes and I save them, it creates a new config file. And I'm going to point out the last two config files. You can see that those are dated. It says today. And if I look at those two config files, these are the changes that I added that ultimately got my mouse working. Now, I already had a bunch of USB support, but I came in and I had added these additional settings. So there's this config UHID I had said yes to. I also said yes to Hydra. I don't know if that's needed. And I'll say that with a lot of these. I don't know if they were absolutely needed, but these are the ones I turned on. And through the batch of two changes here, mouse is working now. Then there's also USB HID boot protocol drivers. And so I configured that to yes for the keyboard and mouse. And then if I go to this other file, these were the additional changes I made. So config input mouse dev ps aux. I set my screen to 1280 by 720, which is what I'm configuring it for on my HDMI output. Mouse GPIO, which I don't think that's necessary, but I did turn that on. And then there's a USB onboard dev, and I had said yes to that one also. So again, it could be that between these two files, I have some extra things, but I wasn't going to dive into look up every one of these. So I kind of turned on batches to see if I could get the mouse working. But between these two batches and what I already had set up, I was able to get the mouse to basically fully work. I did create some notes here. One of the challenges going through all of these different files. So again, I'm going to open up another window here to my project spec, back to where I was on the meta user kernel. You really have to scan through all of these and say, what did I have in this original file that I had enabled? What the next time I did a change, what additional changes were made, and then what additional changes, and kind of have to stack all those up because I might have turned off some things in a later file or turned on some things. What I did is I tried to go through that and put it into this kernel summary text so that I could just scroll through this, and I filtered it down just to the USB stuff. So if you look at what's on my screen now, this is what I have for things that have something to do with USB. And you'll see that, just enter there, but I've got things like media USB support. I've got some stuff for the video that I'm still trying to get working through USB. Probably some things that really do not matter here, like USB PCI. I don't know if I need that or not. Maybe I do. But as I go through this, of course, my OTG for my USB host. This down here is for my video. Both of these would be for the video if I get that to work. I've turned on some of this platform stuff. And then those last two batches of updates would have been down in this section here. So that's all of my USB stuff in the kernel configuration. Now beyond that, I also have to then go in and configure the root FS. So, I pulled up the kernel screen here, and if any of these settings you're looking for, again, you can just do a slash in here and do a search. For example, maybe I'm looking for this one USB onboard dev. So where is that at? I search for that, and it should find it. What did I? Okay, so there's a USB onboard dev, and it shows me that it's within device drivers, USB support, and then onboard USB device support. So I'd have to go make sure that gets selected. It was kind of interesting. One of these, let's see, input. I'm going to go to my protocol drivers. So there's a config USB underscore mouse. This one here was interesting that at the parent level, there's something that actually has to be set to no. So the USB HID has to be set to no for this option even to show up. So I had to turn that off, and then I could turn on this protocol for simple boot mouse support. That was one of the last changes I made that may have made a difference. But in a similar way to modifying the kernel, I would go modify rootfs, and I did the same thing here. Let me just open up Notepad or a text editor here, and let me just bring this file in so we can look at it. And this file, again, is going to go through and just kind of show my entire rootfs, but I'd say for the most part, there's not a lot of stuff here that was really needed for this, but I am going to jump into the rootfs config user interface, and maybe we can look for a couple of things. I have my user packages, so I'm putting in Doom. I've got some of these other things that I put in there, but let me here, and let's figure my rootfs. And I can do a search, and I can do things like search for a mouse. There is one thing I turned on here, XF86 input mouse. Again, this might not be needed until I get to X11 or something like that, but that is the only one in here about a mouse. If I search for USB, there's a lot of USB stuff, but you can see almost all of this is set to no. And what I'm looking at is, what does this in square brackets say? So equals N means I don't have that turned on. And so none of this USB stuff in the rootfs do I have turned on. So I can search for mouse, I can search for USB, but really not a whole lot needed there at this time. But if I go back into kernel, I can do the same type of searching. I can search for mouse, I can search for USB. There's a lot of USB stuff, and that's why I tried to just simply open up this kernel summary and point out the ones that I think are going to make the biggest difference. Now, maybe if I, let's see, get over to GitHub, I do have this repository in here called FPGA, and I did just upload, this is in the PetaLinux 2024 HDMI folder, the latest copy of my project spec. So if you really want to, you're trying to get your mouse, for example, to work, and you want to compare in more detail, what do I have? You can come into this and go into the meta user, go into my kernel. So recipes, kernel, Linux, but then you'll have all of these. And again, you need to kind of go through all of them. So you need to look at what did I have in the basic esp.config, and then you can scroll through the details of every one of these other ones, except for this one. This one is not actually being applied because it's a different extension, one that I had just set aside for a minute. But all the other configs, you can look through them and see what did I turn on. Now, if I'm in the actual kernel configuration over here, again, I can do a slash, and I can search for mouse, and I can go through this list, and there are pages of things. So there's input mouse I have set to yes. These first couple I have set to no. Now, there's a lot of very specific drivers depending on the mouse hardware. Again, that text output that I was showing before is probably a faster way to look through this. But you can see I've got my screen res set, and there's a whole bunch of no's. And this goes on. I'm hitting page down at a time. A lot of stuff that I don't have enabled. There is some stuff I do have enabled. But I would just defer to that text file that I was just showing. And then in the same way, I could search for what am I loading for USB, and that's a really long list of stuff that's in here that is USB related. So this first one is USB support is turned on, so USB equals yes, and then I can scroll through all the details here. But that's where if you're really interested in getting the details, I would just jump out into this GitHub and take a look at this specific folder. You can scroll through these files and see what exact configuration I'm running at the moment. And if you want to back up and look at some of these other things I've done up to this point, for example, modules around my video output, or you want to come up and look at the apps that I put in here. So I've shown these before that I've been using, this FB test that I wrote, and the little LED flasher, and this current Doom that I'm using. Those are all in there and configured. So if you want to have Doom in your PetaLinux, you can just grab this BB file and download the source from that I showed in the last video if you're interested in that. And then I did add one more in here that's just a little miscellaneous that copies some files. It's just a place for me to easily copy a bunch of files into my image. I find the working with layers in PetaLinux, I don't know, is frustrating at times. Things that just should work don't work, and it's just me learning it, but trying to place specific files in specific locations I found is much trickier than it should be, in my opinion. So I ended up just building an app, and that app I can then just embed all these miscellaneous files that I want. For example, I want a script file get copied over. I want an X11, an Xorg config file to get copied over. I can put all of these in this, and as part of the build, it will where I want to place them. But calling this all out, if you want, you can jump into this folder and dig through some of that. So after adding those things, though, to my kernel, which is really where the change was, the last change that I made, now I find that my mouse is working. So, and the first thing, if I go back to my HDMI output, I'll clear this screen. When I go into dev input, what I noticed was that I now had this thing that said mice and mouse 0. So I knew that was a really good sign that something extra had been added for support that wasn't there before when I turned on that last set of USB related input drivers in my kernel. But now I can go into Nano, and I can, this is some text, and I will bring up this so you can see as I'm doing this. But now I can come up here and I can double click on some text. I can press the middle button and that pastes it. So I can highlight, I can copy and paste, and all of that seems to be working. And you can see I can move the mouse around, etc. Now I don't know what else I should be able to do in Nano with a mouse. I thought somewhere I read that I should be able to choose, different, these menu items down here. That doesn't work for me, but obviously the hardware is being recognized, and it's doing something based on my movement and my clicking of mouse buttons and things like that. Now, if I get out of that, I did have within user bin, I have that frame buffer Doom. And if I run that and I get into this, I find that, let's see, I'm just starting a game here, and I can use the arrows to move around and the control key to fire. But then if I grab the mouse, I don't think this FB Doom supports mouse. And what I'm actually seeing is that, yeah, I see the cursor, but it's just highlighting text that's basically in the background on the console, not within the game. And this doesn't actually do anything within the game. So that my assumption at this point is that whatever that game is looking for USB mouse drivers or whatever is not yet what I have configured. Even though the Linux is seeing my mouse and it's let me do something with it, this game is not let me do anything with it. So I'm going to get out of that and clear that. And I still have not been able to get anything X11 related running. So maybe at some point, if I can get to that then the mouse will be much more usable or needed. But I'm still stuck on that. Does not load when I try to get it fired up. So going on half an hour here, but basically, I came in here initially. The main thing was that I did not need anything in my DTSI. The device tree did not need anything special from what I already had. I did not do anything with the rootfs, but I did go in and add some additional things to the kernel drivers. And again, if you're most interested in those things, I would come into my GitHub and take a look at that. But this would be the summary right here, which I'll leave on the screen, of all the USB stuff that I have turned on in my kernel. And then, of course, there's other spots for booting to USB storage and things like that in other parts of the configuration. But the kernel specifically, this is, I think, where you're going to need to have the right thing selected to get the mouse support to work. Keyboard's working, mouse is, I'm going to say, essentially working as far as hardware and the low-level OS. Now, will I find a useful purpose for it? I don't know. We'll see.